Welcome back, listeners, to the Academy DEI podcast. We're thrilled to have today Courtney Ketcham with us. Courtney is our Accessibility Remediation Coordinator at the Academy for Professional Excellence. In her role, she ensures that web and electronic content complies with ADA standards, making it accessible to individuals with disabilities. With nearly 7 years of experience in higher education, Courtney has specialized in accessibility and remediation, administrative support, student success, project management, outreach, and event planning. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in English with a concentration of creative writing from California State University Northridge. Her expertise extends to providing accessible electronic content, including newsletters, presentation, and instructional videos. She's also skilled in video capturing, caption, proofreading, and editing, and overall just video production. So join us as we dive into the importance of DEI and accessibility with Courtney Ketcham. So, Courtney, I'd love to be able to start our conversation today and really asking you what brought you into this line of work?
Yeah, thank you, Charlie, and I appreciate the introduction there. This line of work I started about, I'll say, 8 years ago. I was pretty new to this line of work, and I had heard about accessibility in regards to like physical elements such as parking and knowing about ramps and just more so facility related means of accessibility. However, I joined being a student staff member at the community college I was attending, and I was essentially helping out an individual in the disability support center, and he was and is a blind individual, and I was helping him essentially read out loud text on a screen to him to be able to do his job and to perform in his daily functions, which then slowly and gradually turned into me being his right hand kind of woman or man, essentially helping him out with tasks and learning how to create accessible content for our students to support them in their educational journeys, and just being able to do their classes as best as they could. Essentially, that's where it started as being a student employee, which then I developed a huge passion just to be able to help people out in their daily lives, to know and to empower them to be able to just perform their daily functions.
Sounds like a really powerful introduction to working with somebody with a disability and also accessibility. Courtney, can you help us understand a bit more about what accessibility is?
Now, the way I view it is that I know that there's a lot of different definitions out there about accessibility, but the way I essentially view it is providing equal access to all individuals with or without disabilities, whether they're permanent or temporary, essentially just providing them equitable resources to be able to live out their daily lives. This could be seen as in services, education, jobs, providing them resources for such as independent living skills, really just empowering the individual to step into their own individuality, even if they do have a disability, and knowing that's not a barrier that should keep them away from really living their daily lives.
Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned being able to provide access to all individuals with or without disabilities. So what would that look like for someone maybe without a disability, and how does that intersect with accessibility?
Sure, really great question. Because accessibility, now that it's on the rise as far as it being pertinent and more prevalent in web accessibility, it actually impacts individuals if someone's not as tech savvy, whether that be due to age or just experience or knowledge. Some resources such as different software out there, or making websites perhaps more readable, user friendly, not as intense or advanced, I would say, where someone can easily navigate through a website and get to where they need to go. This could be even in the example of having buttons on a page in the same place on the page, reading exactly where that's going to lead an individual if they click on it. Or this could even be as simple as like it's seen on most websites, but an arrow at the bottom of a web page that leads upwards that says back to top of page. So something like that, as simple as a little feature on a web page, can go a long way with someone who perhaps might not have any type of disability or where they encounter barriers on websites or resources, but just knowing that the website is user friendly or whatever they're using is not as intense where they can get a good understanding of how to use the service. That is something that accessibility achieves in being universal and not only pertaining to individuals with disabilities. So that would be the best answer, I would say.
Yes, thank you for that. That actually reminds me of I was sending an email the other day and I thought about it in the sense where I was sending an email with the flyer on it. And of course, I was asking folks to be able to click on a specific part that is hyperlinked. And so you can see it being shaded in a different way. But then I thought about it, I was like, I think, and I didn't even think about accessibility, but I felt like I was inherently doing it anyways by then writing out these are the specific words you'll be clicking on rather than just saying, oh, click where the hyperlink is shown. And so I think there's those moments where folks be able to think about how are ways where we can really be more inclusive and offering that accessibility in just different moments.
And I'll add as well with that example of the hyperlink too, even though by adding the actual words of where that link is going to be leading to, I should say, even though that helps the individual, specifically those who have a visual disability or
Mm,
perhaps even have a cognitive disability to be able to not, or maybe they process information on different levels than other individuals, that allows them to know where they're going to,
mm,
especially those with a visual disability, if they're using software that reads that link aloud to them, because now you're not there, that individual is not getting on their end www dot and like the whole URL, even though that impacts that population of individuals in either or who either has those types of disabilities. This also can help anybody out because instead of reading the URL and
mm,
having to click on that and not knowing what exactly am I going to be led to, now anybody can read where they're going to be led to and then have
mm,
that general knowledge of going into that document ahead of time
mm,
and being prepared for that. So that's a really great example. And that's actually something that can go back to that last question of how can accessibility really pertain to everyone?
mm,
There we go. It is pretty universal. It's giving everyone the chance to be able to have a more inclusive space to know, to prepare, to know ahead of time and actually know what's going on,
mm.
essentially. And that's essentially what I think accessibility is trying to achieve too, is giving the individual that autonomy and not making a lot of things unknown to everyone.
Mm. Yeah, great point. Thank you. And
Mhm.
I think you've already spoken a little bit about it, but certainly if you want to expand more on it, what do you feel is truly important that you want to highlight about accessibility?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I think I did hit on a lot of things here already, but it's hugely important. That's why I feel like in instance accessibility is on the rise of being more accepted, I think, which unfortunately it should have been accepted like years ago more. But as technology is advancing, we're seeing that accessibility it is really thriving in today's world. But I think it's hugely important because just getting down to the basic fundamental thing or detail about it is that It's really empowering anyone who encounters barriers in life to know that they can function in their daily lives because there are resources out there. There are which are often referred to as accommodations, but it's bringing that power back to the individual. That's how I view it. And I feel like it's so revolutionary.
It makes me think back to when ramps were first introduced for people with wheelchairs to be able to access public buildings and how revolutionary that concept probably was at that point in time. And now thinking about web accessibility, it does feel like we're at this inflection point as a society where we've decided everyone should have equal access to the internet, and how do we make that possible? So it seems like a really important time in our history and a pretty amazing vantage point that we have here, making websites more accessible.
100%. I absolutely agree. I think just knowing that there are ways to make things, I should say, the word that comes to mind is easier, and it goes with accessibility because one of the elements is providing ease of access. But it really is making daily life a little more easier for everyone to be able to know that they can do things. And if, let's just say, a video doesn't have closed captions for an individual who perhaps has an auditory disability, who has partial hearing, or who is deafblind, or who is deaf, I think that goes such a long way, because if they were watching a video and they did not know the information at all, or perhaps even watching TV and not being able to know what's going on in a certain scene, or they wanted to watch their favorite TV show and that wasn't even showing up, the captioning or the subtitles, that would really exclude them from that experience. And the way that just by providing certain features to TV, to entertainment, for online shopping, for ordering food, there's all these little details in life that go such a long way to help us go about every day that some individuals might not get access to, just simply because there's not any resources or features that allow them to be able to gain that information or to access that information, whether it be in reading, whether it be in listening, whether it be in navigating through something. And if there's elements here and there, or even perhaps even walking, like you mentioned, the ramps or the railings, or even perhaps an elevator, there's a lot of little things here and there that still needs working on. But when there are added elements here and there, again, into many of the different areas of life that I've mentioned, I think it really goes a long way for everyone to be able to participate in life and not be excluded. So that would go into the importance too. Making it more inclusive. Making life more inclusive. There we go.
I think we've talked a little bit about this as well, but I'm curious to have you expand on it a bit more. So who does web accessibility benefit?
So essentially, like how I was mentioning with the example of web accessibility being universal, it really is everyone. It helps out those who have disabilities that do really perhaps like websites create barriers for them to access information, or being able to access perhaps a certain website or classwork online, or a video, I should say, a video chat surface or program such as Zoom. It really impacts a lot of different populations of people. And it could be even age related, it can be knowledge related, it can be a whole different amount of factors. So by making websites and videos online or documents online accessible for people to easily navigate through, to easily use, to easily read, whether that be using technology and software such as screen readers or any other type of features. There's also magnifying features for any individuals who need the text to be large, or even having video transcripts as an option for any individual who needs to be able to read what's going on in a video, along with closed captioning to make images stand out on a web page. That can impact so many people because, again, we're just trying to achieve everyone being able to get that access to the information, to know what's going on, to make it not unknown, and to make it more inclusive for everyone on different factors. And this kind of also it goes into the topic of intersectionality, where accessibility really is impacting so many different, like how I mentioned, different populations of people. The disability community is an intersectional, or disability in itself is an intersectional identity, because you could have so many individuals coming from different demographics or backgrounds, or even sexual orientation too, or gender identity. And any individuals could perhaps have a disability sometime in their lifetime, or maybe not. But disability can happen at any point in your lifetime, and it can happen to anybody. So by having all of these resources with web accessibility, with physical accessibility, such as facility related features to allow them to access that building or parking or whatever it may be, it really helps so many people out. So we're not like talking just a few, we're talking a large, huge population of people. So this is why it's so hugely important that this is on the rise, and hopefully continues to flourish too.
Yeah, good transition there. I think in talking about just a large population as a whole entire universe experienced the pandemic. And I can only imagine the pandemic impacted so many people in different ways. And so can you share a little bit more about like how did the pandemic affect web accessibility?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, Charlie. The pandemic hit so many people in so many different ways. And I just want to highlight one particular um, condition that is now considered also a disability, or is recognized within the disability community, is long COVID, and having long COVID symptoms that pertain or prolong due to the pandemic. And if anybody has experienced, that is something that's now being widely recognized as, and not in a negative way, but in the way of knowing that's something that people could possibly be experiencing still to this day, where it's impacting their own health and their way of life now. But in the way of web accessibility impacting the pandemic, the really good thing that came about was remote work and increasing that telework, which is a reasonable accommodation. And most companies are still adapting that, I should say, accommodation, essentially, and having the impact of, or having that be prevalent in today's world of remote work just goes such a long way, because individuals can have the leisure of working at home. They don't have to feel as if they have to go into their workplace, and perhaps that workplace might not even be accessible to them. I think programs such as like Zoom, Google Meet, knowing that these programs have the capability of having some accessibility features such as closed captioning, or the ability to grab a web or a video transcript, excuse me, having the functionality of giving the option to individuals to participate via the chat and not verbally. I think that's something that goes a long way that we didn't have before in perhaps like a in-person meeting setting, where if individuals didn't, or maybe couldn't participate verbally, I should say, excuse me, now having this feature of typing in, or maybe speaking into a program that types for you or for them into a Zoom chat to be able to participate, is such a huge deal. And I think it's really allowed for the acceptance of using different technological resources for people in their work. But I should say just the really big one is the remote work. And I think being able to provide employees with that option where they have a certain amount of comfort when approaching work is huge. And I think also too, I should just hit on that a lot of different, I think I feel like almost as if it opened up possibilities of knowing that there are different ways to operate in a company too, as far as because a lot of the materials are electronic or for example, the Academy, we use Google Suite or we use PowerPoint presentations or we use electronic materials. I'll just use this as an example. A lot of times we email the materials ahead of time so people can prepare for that. That simple step is essentially an accessibility best practice that now as a company we're adapting. So that is an example where it was great that we adopted that because that goes such a long way in helping individuals prepare for their work too. It was a really great thing. Essentially, I think if anything, the pandemic wasn't great, but it did open a world up of possibility.
I think and you touched on this, that the pandemic kind of sped up the ways that we were thinking about accessibility, and it forced us to, right? But now we find ourselves in this place of thinking creatively about accessibility. You mentioned closed captions that are built into different video conferencing software. Those are typically powered by AI. And it's hard to think about accessibility without AI and like where the future of accessibility is going. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on where accessibility is going?
Yeah, I would like for it to go and continue to blossom. I definitely do think that with the adaptation of AI or more innovation there, it will be pretty intertwined, I think. And essentially, that could be a really good thing too, because if that's being programmed into a lot of services and software, it might just be at the forefront. So there's not going to be a lot of manual work to do, essentially. Just having accessibility being more tried on through companies choosing to use programs or even that being more or programs out there being more, I guess the word that I could use, accessible to individuals to be able to grab on or to try on or to use. I think that's going to be great. I think also too, we're in the accessibility world, I should say, those of us who are working on creating accessible content, I think we're getting the information that the law of the WCAG, I should say, which stands for Web Accessibility, or excuse me, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Those guidelines continue to evolve. However, they branch off of the fundamental guidelines that were set forth by the organization that created the guidelines. But with the evolution of those guidelines and the innovation of different products, I think it's going to be more and more adopted. I surely hope so, where a lot of different programs out there that are web-based and perhaps maybe more media programs too, or entertainment could adopt that on where it's not hard to do because now we have programs that could do it for us. So there's no excuse to back out and not make things accessible. So I think definitely, though, there also needs to be more heart behind promoting accessibility, I should say, and really diving into it, because that's where my passion comes from, knowing that not only knowing that, oh, this is a cool program, it's going to make work easier and life easier, that's great and all. And I think that's going to really fuel the fire to make it go further. But the other element is knowing who this is impacting at the end of the day. And knowing how a simple program can make someone's life just that much more easier, I think is something that the manual work still allows for. Maybe not so much the AI, but I think just going back to that, I hope they're going to be intertwined where it brings about more positivity than taking away from the value that accessibility brings.
Yeah, I like that you brought up just like the part of putting more heart into it, because I think part of that is how do we really encourage folks and really motivate folks to really prioritize accessibility more. If you can expand a little bit more on that piece of it, like how can we strive to motivate others to prioritize accessibility a little bit more?
Yeah, I know when I try to talk about it, and I've already expressed, I just go back to my own experience with individuals with disabilities and knowing how certain things can go such a long way for them through their own expression of the barriers they might face when trying to access websites or programs, or being able to read their own textbooks, or being able to watch a video on their own, or being able to live independently. So a lot of it comes from, I know, at least myself, being able to talk to individuals who might encounter barriers in life. But perhaps if someone doesn't have the opportunity to be able to speak to anybody to hear from their own experience, I would say just really empathizing. I think it really hits on the empathy element, not devaluing someone's experience or taking credit for it, and really putting yourself in their shoes, but trying to put yourself in that environment of knowing, if I couldn't read this well, if I could not see text in an image well, or if I could not maybe understand or comprehend what I just read in this paragraph. There's so many different examples that you could pull from, or even if I could not hear what's going on in a video, what would I want? How could I be able to move forward in life? How could I be able to understand what's going on? Wouldn't I want something to help me? So I like to not, again, devalue someone's experience because maybe I have not experienced that myself, but being able to get down to a level of understanding that if you yourself were going through different barriers in life or felt where you couldn't move forward, wouldn't but getting to that point of knowing that if something so simple could go such a long way of being able to watch a video or being able to read a book or being able to walk or being able to type on a computer, it's it's something that really comes from the heart of knowing that this is something that's just trying to make life easier. And life is so hard that having ways of making it easier just goes such a long way that I feel like it comes from a passionate heart. That's where it feels me to do this work, knowing that I'm being able to contribute to someone's experience in life, not as a prideful thing, but just as a humble thing of an honor to be able to do that for someone really is just so impactful and so rewarding that I try to give that same feeling to other individuals. So knowing that they're impacting someone's life to make it that much easier, or maybe it's a little thing that can just, again, really be so universal and so hugely positive is just amazing. And I think that's why knowing that this is becoming more and more popular is just wonderful. So I would just encourage people to have more empathy and knowing that even if they're contributing in some little aspect to making things accessible, they really are impacting people's lives to some extent.
At the Academy, so I work as a learning experience designer here at the Academy. So I help build some of our e-learnings. We as a team have been captioning videos for I don't know historically how long, but longer than I've been in the position. And I know that prior to me coming on, it was a manual process. So somebody would sit and listen to the video and do a one-to-one transcription of the video, add those captions in, and then the video be captioned for learners. Now we can use AI software and take that video, put it into the AI software, and within minutes you have this beautiful transcript that is pretty much 99% accurate, and it really has innovated that portion of our work. So when I think about accessibility and AI, I think about it as kind of being mutually necessary for one another. So in order to do like the important work of making learning accessible to all individuals, there's a lot of manual labor that's involved in that. And I'm seeing a lot of opportunity to use AI to cut down on some of that manual labor and allow the people who are building the learning or creating the content to think more creatively about the content and less about kind of the manual one-to-one transcription, for example.
I know that you mentioned that the LX and UX team use, am I messing that up? LXD. There we go.
You can call us whatever.
Okay.
LXD, I think, is probably the acronym that the Academy uses. Yeah.
Okay. So Shane, I know you mentioned that the LXD team uses services, most importantly with closed captioning. Do you mind just elaborating on those services that you use and sharing with the audience of what services those are and like the names or how to access them if they want to look into that?
Sure. Yeah. As far as captioning videos, we're using a product called Sonics right now. It's an AI software that you plug in your video and the software analyzes it and splits it out into speakers and does a really great job at getting a pretty almost 100% accurate transcription from your video. And that took typically, depending on how quickly and accurately the person typed, that was probably a half to a full day's worth of work. And it now takes about 45 minutes to do an entire video. So definitely improving our workflow. Some other things that we've done as a program is to look at the different standards that are put out by WCAG and then use those and convert them into design standards for our e-learning. So at first we were remediating. So we were taking existing e-learning and making it accessible. Once we got the directive to make all e-learning accessible, we started thinking from the forefront, how do we do that? So we're not going backwards, we're starting that universal design from the beginning of an e-learning. So some of those choices that we've made are on font sizes, on never using just color to determine what's interactive on a page. We check and create color contrast guidelines. So we're using colors that work well with each other and contrast well with each other. We caption all of our videos. We tend to use interactions that are fully accessible, and if not possible, if for some reason the interaction, maybe it's a simulation or something more technical, cannot be built out fully accessibly, we'll create a one-to-one text version of that interaction. So the individual using a screen reader, for example, can have a similar to almost identical experience as a person who's actually interacting with a mouse with an interaction. So I would say that at this point, accessibility considerations are woven into the entire design process of the e-learnings that we're building. And part of that is enhanced through AI software, and other parts are the team thinking creatively about how we can create content that is understandable to all different types of people who would be interacting with our e-learnings.
I think it's great that you mentioned the concept of universal design because I think that's so hugely important. And that's actually something that I encourage individuals as well to incorporate if they want to go into making accessible content. Because I should just add too that on my end, a lot of what I'm doing is remediating the content or curriculum, like you had mentioned, Shane, that the team was doing firsthand off, making the content or curriculum that's finished already, going back in and making that accessible, essentially using that whole concept of universal design and really making the content accessible at the forefront while you're designing that content is so much more helpful, because now you're, again, like you said, weaving those features into the product instead of going back at the end and doing everything, which allows for, if there's any fixes here and there in the process, you could do both things at the same time. You can make sure that the content is what you want for the final product, but you can also make it accessible as you go. And that's something that I would encourage everyone to do if they're, of course, you want to learn how to make accessible content. So that will take some time to know how to do it, essentially, which, of course, will put you in the position of remediating stuff at the end of the day. However, though, if you want to work towards where, one, it's a more efficient workload, and two, where you're actually hands-on learning how to design something accessibly in the moment, I think it's just so much more helpful once you do learn those concepts, because then it's more, it is a nicer workflow and you are able to catch things head on. So that's something I would encourage everyone to do as well once they learn how to create accessible content, to just go do it as they go, because it's like a muscle that if you continue to practice it and you continue to work with it, it's just going to be like natural through your whole design process.
It's totally a muscle. I love that you described it that way, especially like using a screen reader, for example. If I haven't used my screen reader in 2 or 3 months, I have to teach myself the screen reader again. But if I'm using it monthly, I'm getting used to NVDA in his voice, and I feel like there's a connection between the two of us, and we can design together and understand this
Yeah.
together. Yeah, I agree. It also, designing accessibly from the beginning creates more authentic learning. It's not like we've designed something and then we have created some accessible solution to it. It's we've taken this concept and thought about how all different individuals will interact with it from the beginning. So it doesn't feel like this plus that. It feels like we started with this product and it works for everybody. So it, to me, creates a more authentic learning experience, in addition to making our lives as designers or remediators or whatever our role is in this process just easier, more efficient.
I absolutely agree with you on that. I think that hits on the heart of accessibility, essentially, too, being able to approach it right away and evaluating how is this going to be inclusive to everyone, really bringing up those questions of what can we do to make it more inclusive. I think when you're starting with accessibly designing something from the start. I love that. Thank you for describing that, because that is so true. So if anyone gets that point again of learning how to do this and then wants to incorporate it into designing something accessibly from the start, I would highly encourage that, because once you learn how to do a lot of these things, and trust me, like the thing that I like to also express to people is that it's an ongoing learning experience, even for us designers and us remediators, or those of us who are in the accessibility world. There's so much advancement, there's a lot to learn, not only in creating accessible content, such as like myself, where I'm working a lot with documents, presentations. There's a lot of advancements in web accessibility and e-learnings and creating videos and creating a lot of materials that are either improving or changing, or there's new advancements, there's new software, just like you had mentioned, Shane, NVDA, which is the screen reader. There's a lot of different screen readers out there. There's a lot of different what are called assistive technology, so devices that could help individuals being able to use to navigate through accessible content. A lot of it is a huge learning experience, not only for the individual being able to use these programs, services, accessible content on the end, that what we call the consumer or the individual who's using these materials, but it's a learning experience for all of us who are trying to contribute to this work too. So that's what I find fascinating about accessibility as well, that it's a huge learning experience for myself.
I totally agree.
Mhm.
Yeah, I love where this conversation is going, because then it really now speaks to there is an intentional effort that goes into it for those who are creating this content, and those who are then being able to contribute to how there can be more accessibility for the user, as you talked about. So I think something I thought about, and as you all were talking, was that fortunately the academy does have yourself in serving in this role and really being able to focus on that piece of it. And I would imagine like there's some work that goes into it. And so like what can you speak to in terms of other organizations being able to prioritize accessibility more? So any sort of tips or resources, or ways that they can look at things a little bit differently to help other organizations that may not have a specific person designated for this work?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked this question, Charlie, because I know not only is it like a mandate or a law, or it is a law that needs to can be, excuse me, be complied with. There's a lot of resources out there, such as different organizations that are consulting organizations that can come in and audit any materials or help guide individuals or companies, I should say, or organizations in making their content accessible, where they could reach out and perhaps contract them to come in and work on their products, or even educate individuals on how to learn more how to create accessibly or to remediate their documents or websites or whatever their services are. Um, and I'm trying to think of some. There's a huge accessibility realm on LinkedIn. I know that I follow. One of them I know is called Disability IN. They're a huge resource for more specifically for finding with disabilities jobs, but then they also do provide like some resources on how to make your content accessible, and they have blogs on their website. Also, there's another organization called Accessibility Works. There's a whole world out there that there's a lot of different organizations that provide more education. One being a huge one, Microsoft. They have a lot of different resources out there, even just to do what I do as far as creating accessible documents, PowerPoint presentations, Excel spreadsheets. So by going to their website, just Microsoft.com or Microsoft's website, you could go and view so many different videos and educational resources out there to be able to learn how to do the fundamental accessibility features and learn how to design. They also touch on universal design as well on their website too. So what I would encourage is to look into a lot of resources out there just by searching how to make accessible content. Then also a huge organization is the I'm so butchering it. I think it's the WC3 or the W3C, I think. And then I think it's the WAI. They're organizations that they're the ones that house the WCAG guidelines, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which I will just say the WCAG is not as easily comprehensible, unfortunately, to probably the average reader or average person. Even myself, sometimes I have to think in my own head, okay, what are they meaning by this? But on their website, they do go into the acronym of POUR, which stands for perceivable, operable, usable, robust, and go into each element of that's what accessible content needs to be. It needs to be easily understood. It needs to be easily usable to be able to navigate through, to be able to use. And it's more so pertaining to web accessibility, but this can also be applied to documents and materials, and it needs to be well thought out. That's where the element of universal design comes into really knowing, okay, how is this going to impact any user? I know that was a long thought, drawn out answer, but I would say definitely if any organizations want to look into making their content accessible, if they are not or do not have the means to hire on an individual with the expertise to do so, I would definitely suggest looking into organizations out there online. There's a lot of different accessible organizations, again, that provide consulting, that provide education on how to create accessible content, that provide the guidelines to follow, even listening to individuals who are accessibility advocates or those who are within the disability community, of knowing, okay, what are individuals needing? What are they wanting? How are they benefiting from different services? I know it's highly encouraged if you have the possibility to do of having individuals with disabilities using your services or programs and getting their input or feedback on what's working for them, what's not working for them. A lot of user feedback is highly, I think, helpful in this case. But again, everyone's experience is going to be different. So you can't really, I don't think, know if the experience of one, let's just say one individual who is blind or one individual who has low vision are going to have the same experience with the content. But just knowing that if you're hearing from any individual who is trying to use your content and it's not accessible in any shape or form, or maybe missing the little details here and there, I think it's really helpful to hear from the user of what's going wrong here and how can we improve this. So there's different ways here and there. Definitely just there's a lot of resources out online to look up and to really benefit from. I know Adobe Acrobat also has resources out there as far as videos go on how to make content accessible through that, and then or through using the program, because that's another element of making documents and materials readable through screen readers. That's something that I do. So there's just a whole world of resources out there that we can provide, as well as additional ways of looking into creating accessible content and how do we move forward with it.
I think in the show notes for this episode, we can include some links that you use and my team uses as well to support individuals who are listening right now. I think also, just to piggyback on what you just said, Courtney, this is the law. If you are funded federally by state or county, you must create accessible products. And it's the right thing to do. Not only is this what we should be doing as social service providers, but what brings everyone together and allows everyone who needs to interact with their content to be able to do. It's the law, but it's also the right thing.
You hit it right on the dot. That's what I try to explain to a lot of individuals, specifically in the accessibility community here at the Academy, that it's law, but it also is morally right.
Okay, so yeah, I think you've shared a lot already about how organizations can really take this initiative in being able to make this work for their organization and really be able to do the work correctly and what's right in this area. And so I'm sure folks are highly interested in knowing a little bit about what's behind the curtain, what goes into your process of being able to remediate content. And I think specifically too, something I was wondering, is that something you're just doing independently, or are you partnering with anyone to be able to do that process?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So I am doing it primarily independently. I do partner with some individuals depending on certain projects or curriculum. Where it becomes a little more collaboration or a collaborative process, I should say, is when I'm working on curriculum that is owned by another developer outside of CWS or organization or a program, I should say. So in those processes, I do want to make sure that I am respecting the developer's content, to be transparent with them of what actually is going to be going on. And a lot of different elements that I focus on going into that content or that curriculum, even if it's owned by another developer or if we as CWDS or a staff member within our program created the content, a lot of things that I look at, or I should say, approach. So a lot of what I approach in the content, whether it's developed by another developer outside of CWS or even by a staff member in CWS, are elements here and there that really focus on the actual body content. I look at font size, I look at, or I work on, I should say, making sure that text is readable on every slide, on every page. That font size is not too large, but not too small. Just as an example, font size does need to be about, the minimum is 12 to 14, but large text can be anywhere from 18 on. But if it's smaller than that, it does need to be bolded in some cases. I even look at little details such as making sure that there's no misunderstood acronyms. So making sure that acronyms are spelled out. And so that does take some process, a lot of the collaborative process where I'm working with the developer. I do have back and forth communication with them to make sure, okay, is this something that can be elaborated on, such as in the case with acronyms, or do you need this in this page? Do we want to keep this? So it's a lot of just back and forth with them to make sure that the curriculum is maintaining its original purpose of what needs to be there, but then also going into elements at a closer stance. But this is where Shane had mentioned that remediation is definitely a manual process. It really is, because not only am I looking at the text essentially in itself of, again, fixing font size, fixing font type to make sure that the letters are readable and legible, because some font types or font styles, I should say, the letters bleed into each other, or meaning that they overlap or they look very similar to each other. I'm also approaching remediation in the way of really analyzing, are images essential to the content or important to the content? Because a lot of times when people do develop curriculum, of course, you want to make it pretty as a designer, visually appealing, but the one downside is to images is that images can take away from the content, more so in the way of if an image is added and it's got a lot of color. And an example is, I should say, with graphs more specifically, or charts, when color is used to determine certain levels or certain areas of percentages or data, I should say, that takes away from someone's experience for those individuals who cannot visually see that color or understand, oh, that color is pertaining to that data mark. Really approaching images in the way of, okay, is this something that someone needs to understand? Or is this something that's just added here for decoration? So that's also a huge process of questioning the content in itself. Is this going to add to the person's experience of learning, or is this not? And in the cases of where I'm working with CWS owned content, I have a little more agency to move things here and there. But with the collaborative process of working with a developer who wasn't, or who created the content themselves, I should say, I do honor that. I'll keep the image, but then I'll add an image description, which is just simply like a paragraph, or it could be a paragraph, it could be a couple sentences just describing what's happening in that image. to make sure that anybody who's approaching the content knows exactly what's going on there. So it's very much a manual process of going page by page, I'll say. Making sure that every page has accessible features. The good thing about working in Microsoft programs, and I should have started out by saying that, I do work in Microsoft Word and Microsoft PowerPoint because Microsoft does have accessibility checkers where I can go in and check on the content as I'm going to make sure it will highlight different errors that are happening in the document, and it will highlight any warnings that I need to go back to and fix in the document. But that's one part of the process, essentially making sure that everything in the content, text, images, there's also, you need to make sure that, or I make sure, I should say, that every document in every PowerPoint has a structure to it, meaning that there's heading styles that I need to make sure that are applied, and headings pertain to any paragraphs, any titles of a document, any titles of a slide, I should say. And just to give an example of how, I guess I should say, like the weight of the work can be, not only is it manual, but PowerPoint presentations and documents can be as large as maybe 80 to 90 pages, 80 to 90 slides sometimes, or it could be as low as 30 slides or 20 slides. But even then, it does take a lot of attention to detail, which is fun, but it can be a lot to just make sure that you're not forgetting details here and there, features here and there, especially before moving it on to the next stage of the process, which the next stage of the process is going into Adobe Acrobat for me, where that program is not as user friendly, where everything needs to be final in the content before going to that program, because it's hard to edit anything. So that's where the process can be elongated, where if any updates or changes are made to content essentially in that PowerPoint presentation or in that Microsoft Word document, or even a Google Docs document, I should say, that I'm working on, if anybody's actively working on that document at that time, which of course they wouldn't know if I'm working on it unless we had that communication. So I give grace for that, but it can make the work go backwards, where I have to go back into that actual physical content and make sure that whatever changes are made, that still is remaining accessible in the final product that I'm going to be producing for the delivery. But I should just say, in Adobe Acrobat, that's the stage where everything's been made accessible in Microsoft programs, but now we're here in Adobe Acrobat to make everything readable. And the manual process goes from going detail by detail in the actual body of the content, I should say. Now it goes to making sure that every piece of content in that document, in that PowerPoint presentation slides, are tagged or given a category of what that actual piece of content needs to be read as. And those categories will then communicate to screen readers to let the program know, okay, this is what I need it to be read aloud as. So if it's a heading, it's going to be read as a heading. And again, a heading is a title. Or if it's an image, it needs to be read as figure or image, and say what that image is, like the description. Or even if it's text, it needs to be read aloud as text or paragraph. So it's a lot of manual process, but thankfully there's some optimization and innovation in that stage, where I will encourage anyone who is remediating to know that they're not completely alone in doing all of the things manually, because when converting accessible content from Microsoft to Adobe, there is a way, and by default, I think it's selected, where you're not totally alone in creating the tags in Adobe Acrobat. When you save it as, or save that document from Microsoft to Adobe, Adobe will automatically create the tags structure for you. It's just the manual process of going in and making sure that everything is properly tagged. There's no spaces that are read as blank, and everything's in correct chronological order. So it's definitely a manual process. There are programs out there that probably are a little more advanced than Adobe and Microsoft. I just use those in particular because they can be user friendly and they're free, or at least free to us at the Academy, which is nice to use. But there are many different programs out there that use or allow you to create accessible content, but they are paid programs typically.
Thank you for sharing all that, Courtney. It brings us back to the whole universal design concept, where if things are created with the lens of accessibility from the beginning, that it makes that process of creating accessible documents that much easier. I'm thinking we could potentially put together a small checklist of what you just described, because I do think that a lot of those choices could be made at the front end that would not only support the person creating the content, but then the person who is actually making that content accessible. So yeah, thank you for sharing. I would like to thank everyone for joining us on today's episode as we explored the intersection of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility with Courtney Ketcham. Her insights into ADA compliance and her extensive experience in creating accessible content have given us a deeper understanding of the importance of making digital spaces inclusive for everyone. We hope you found this discussion as enlightening and inspiring as we did. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more conversations with experts who are making a difference in the world of DEI. If you have any questions or feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, stay committed to making the world a more inclusive space.